The moment Abel stepped between the 5 silent goats and the angry mob marching towards his property, he understood that his whole life had been a preparation for this moment of choice, to protect misunderstood creatures or to succumb to the collective fear that had already destroyed so many lives in the backcountry. 6 months before this decisive confrontation, Abel Walker walked through the parched furrows of his property, observing the land that had refused to bear fruit for 3 consecutive years. The sun mercilessly punished the dry land of Dry Creek, and the clouds were empty promises that passed without leaving a single drop of hope. At 45, Abel carried on his stooped shoulders the weight of a life dedicated to ungrateful land. A widower for 5 years, since conception passed away from a disease that the big city doctors couldn't explain or cure, he had become a solitary and melancholic figure in the small rural community. His only companions were the memories of his wife and the certainty that somewhere there was still enough kindness in the world to justify his remaining in it. Abel's property was on the edge of town, in an area that locals avoided after nightfall, not out of mere superstition, but because there, loneliness took on almost physical contours, and the night wind carried echoes of conversations that no one was having anymore. It was a place where silence had texture and melancholy materialized in the grayish color of the scrubland. Conception always said that Abel had too soft a heart to be a rancher. She would watch him collect injured birds, feed abandoned dogs, and share his home's food with any hungry animal that showed up at his door. "You have a caregiver's soul, Abel," she used to say with a loving smile. "One day this will be your blessing or your ruin." After his wife's death, Abel had sunk into a seemingly bottomless sadness. He stopped caring for his appearance, isolated himself from his neighbors, and began to talk mainly to the few animals remaining on the property: 2 old hens, a lame cat that had appeared during a storm, and a few common goats that produced just enough milk for their own survival. The Dry Creek community was small and conservative. People had known each other for generations, shared the same concerns about rain and harvest, and maintained traditions that their grandparents had brought from other regions of the backcountry. It was a place where new ideas were received with suspicion and differences were seen as threats to the established order. The community's informal leader was Colonel August Perry, a 60-year-old man who had inherited land and political influence from his family. Although never a military man, the title of colonel had stuck to his name through generations of local power. He was a man of rigid convictions who believed that each person should know and accept their place in the region's social hierarchy. Colonel Perry viewed Abel with a mixture of disdain and concern. Disdain because he considered him a weak man, unable to make his land produce or to recover after the loss of his wife. Concern because problematic landowners like Abel could affect the value of neighboring lands and attract undesirable elements to the region. "That man is becoming a dead weight on our community," Colonel Perry commented in the informal meetings that took place at Antonio's General Store, the small shop that served as the region's social center. "He lets his land lie fallow, doesn't participate in anything, and on top of that he talks to himself. That's not normal." The colonel's comments resonated with some people in the community, but also caused discomfort in others. Donna Socorro, the local midwife and one of the most respected women in the region, always defended Abel. "That man is suffering," she said firmly. "He lost the woman he loved and doesn't know how to live anymore. Instead of judging him, we should be helping." "Socorro, you're too good," replied the colonel. "But kindness has limits. There comes a time when everyone has to fend for themselves." It was amidst this environment of judgment and prejudice that old Jedediah Coyote, an itinerant trader known for selling animals and medicinal plants, arrived in the region. Jedediah was a legendary figure in the backcountry. Some said he knew ancient secrets about herbs and cures. Others claimed he was just a shrewd old man who knew how to impress naive people. Jedediah arrived at Abel's property on a scorching hot morning, pulling a cart carrying 5 goats unlike any seen in the region. They were medium-sized animals with uniform gray coats, but what was most striking was their behavior. They made no noise and walked with unsettling synchronicity, as if sharing the same thought. "Good morning, my friend," said Jedediah, removing his faded straw hat. "I hear you're a kind man and treat animals well." Abel, who was mending a fence, looked curiously at the silent goats. "That's true, but I don't have any money to buy anything, Jedediah." "Who mentioned buying? The old man smiled, revealing few teeth. These goats are special. They came from far away, from a region where people know things that have been forgotten around here. They give a lot of milk, hardly eat anything, and are silent company for those who need peace. Abel approached the animals and noticed something peculiar in their eyes. It wasn't exactly sadness, but a kind of depth he had never seen in domestic animals. It was as if they carried ancient memories, stories they couldn't tell. "Why are they so quiet?" he asked. "Some creatures learn that silence is the safest way to exist in the world," Jedediah Coyote replied enigmatically. "They've seen things humans do to each other, and decided it's best not to draw attention." The old trader's words struck a deep chord in Abel's heart. He himself had chosen silence after Conception's death, deciding it was safer not to expose himself to the judgments and expectations of others. "What do you want in return?" he asked. "Nothing but the promise that you'll take good care of them. They've suffered enough in their lives." Abel accepted the goats without knowing this decision would completely change the course of his existence. In the first few days, the animals stayed close to the house, grazing silently and observing all the movements of their new caretaker with almost human attention. To Abel's surprise, the goats produced a lot of milk, exceptionally good milk, creamy and flavorful. More importantly, they seemed to understand his grief. When he sat on the porch on melancholy afternoons, remembering Conception, the goats would approach and stay close, as if offering silent companionship. "You understand, don't you?" Abel murmured to them. "You know what it's like to carry a weight on your chest." The goats looked at him with their deep eyes, and Abel felt that, somehow, they truly understood his loneliness. During the first few weeks, the presence of the new animals went unnoticed by the community. Abel kept his discreet routine, sold the excess milk at Antonio's general store, and gradually began to feel less isolated. The goats were constant company, and their silent presence brought a comfort he hadn't experienced since his wife's death. It was Dona Socorro who first noticed the change in Abel. "You're different," she observed when he showed up at the store with more milk than usual. "More present. I haven't seen you with that color in your face in a long time." Abel smiled shyly. It was true that he felt better. The goats had brought not only material sustenance, but also a kind of purpose. He had again creatures dependent on his care, and this made him get up every morning with energy. But not everyone in the community viewed Abel's transformation favorably. Colonel August, always attentive to the movements in the region, began asking questions about the origin of the new animals. "Where did these goats come from?" he asked Abel directly during a visit to the store. "A trader passed by and left them with me." "Which trader? What was his name?" the colonel insisted. Abel realized his answer had sounded evasive, but the truth was he knew very little about Jedediah Coyote. The old man had appeared, delivered the goats, and disappeared again into the vastness of the countryside. He was an elderly gentleman, said his name was Jedediah Coyote. The name caused murmurs among the people present at the store. Some knew the old trader's reputation, and not all the stories about him were reassuring. "Jedediah Coyote," murmured Antonio, the store owner. "I've heard that name around here. They say he trades strange things." "Strange how?" asked Abel, beginning to feel uncomfortable. "Animals that aren't normal, plants that do unusual things," replied Colonel August. "Superstitious people seek this kind of trader when they want to solve problems in an unconventional way." The colonel's words planted a seed of doubt in Abel's mind. He had noticed that the goats were indeed different from ordinary animals, but he had attributed this to their good genetics or proper care. Could there be something more disturbing in their nature? In the days that followed, Abel began to observe the goats more closely. He noticed that they always moved together, as if guided by a collective instinct. When one stood up, they all stood up. When one headed to a certain place, the others followed immediately. It was a synchronicity that went beyond normal herd behavior. More intriguing was the fact that they never made a sound. Ordinary goats bleat regularly, especially during feeding or when separated from the group. But these five remained constantly silent, communicating through subtle glances and movements that Abel was beginning to understand. One night, Unable to sleep because of the doubts the colonel had planted in his mind, Abel decided to observe the goats during the early morning hours. He silently left the house and walked to the corral where they slept. What he saw left him simultaneously amazed and disturbed. The 5 goats were awake, arranged in a circle in the center of the corral, and seemed to be participating in some kind of silent ritual. They moved their heads in sync, as if following a music only they could hear, and their eyes shone with a light Abel had never noticed during the day. More surprising was the fact that around them, small nocturnal animals had gathered. Rabbits, rodents, even some birds remained motionless in concentric circles, as if participating in the goats' silent ceremony. Abel remained watching for several minutes, hypnotized by the scene. There was nothing threatening in the animals' behavior, but there was definitely something unusual. It was as if the goats possessed a kind of natural magnetism that attracted other creatures. The next morning, life returned to normal. The goats grazed peacefully, the other animals had dispersed, and there was no sign of the nocturnal ritual. Abel began to question whether he had really seen what he thought he had seen, or if his lonely mind was creating fantasies. That's when rumors of strange events in the region reached the community. Dona Maria, who lived on the property closest to Abel's, reported that her hens had started laying eggs in unusual quantities. Su Joao, who raised pigs, said that his animals were more docile and healthy than ever. It's like something in the region is doing the animals good. Dona Maria commented at the general store. Colonel August listened to the reports with growing suspicion. In his world view, inexplicable changes were always cause for concern, especially when they involved elements beyond his control or comprehension. If you are interested in stories about the mysteries and transformations that happen in the American countryside, subscribe to the channel to follow other fascinating accounts like this, where the inexplicable meets the simple humanity of the rural community. This started after those goats arrived, he said to his supporters. It can't be a coincidence. The colonel's suspicion intensified when he learned that Abel was prospering. The goat's milk was in high demand, and Abel had managed to pay off some old debts. For someone used to seeing Abel as a failure, this transformation was disturbing. A man who for years couldn't even make corn grow in the ground, suddenly prosperous because of 5 goats. The colonel questioned. That's not natural. Suspicions gained strength when the first reports of unusual animal behavior in the region during the night appeared. Several people claimed to have seen their pets walking towards Abel's property during the early morning hour, returning before dawn. My dog goes out every night, reported Mrs. Francis. When I wake up, he's lying normally in the backyard, but I know he went out. He has wet fur from the dew and a different smell. The reports created an atmosphere of anxiety in the community. People who before didn't even pay attention to Abel now watched him suspiciously when he appeared at the general store or church on Sundays. Abel noticed the change in attitude but couldn't fully understand its origin. He knew the goats were special, but he also knew they were gentle creatures that posed no threat to anyone. The community's suspicion hurt him deeply, especially as it recalled the judgments he had suffered after Conception's death. The situation worsened when Colonel August decided to take more direct action. He organized an informal meeting at the general store to discuss the situation affecting the region's tranquility. The meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon, when most people were free to attend. Folks, we all know strange things are happening around here, the colonel began. Animals acting differently, changes we can't explain. All this started when that man brought those strange goats here. Abel wasn't present at the meeting, but Dona Socorro bravely defended him. You're talking about a hard-working and honest man who has never hurt anyone, she said. Abel takes good care of his animals and is prospering honestly. Why should that be a problem for anyone? Socorro, you're a good person, but sometimes goodness blinds us to dangers, the colonel replied. There are things in this world that we don't understand, and when these things appear in our community, we have to be careful. The meeting ended without concrete decisions, but with a dangerous consensus. Abel and his goats should be watched more closely. Some people volunteered to do nighttime patrols in the region, officially to protect the community's safety. Abel learned about the meeting through Dona Socorro, who went to his house to warn him. "Abel, you need to be careful," she said, with evident concern. "The colonel is spreading distrust about you and your goats. Some people in town are starting to believe nonsense." "But I haven't done anything wrong, Dona Socorro. The goats are gentle, they don't bother anyone." "I know, son, but when people are afraid, they don't always act reasonably." Abel began to live under constant tension. He knew he was being watched, that his movements and those of his goats were under permanent scrutiny. The prosperity he had achieved came to be seen as evidence of irregularity, and his emotional bond with the animals was interpreted as a sign of mental imbalance. The pressure increased when the accidents began. His fence was mysteriously broken one night, allowing the goats to escape. Fortunately, they returned on their own the next morning, but the incident was interpreted by the community as evidence that the animals were uncontrollable. On another occasion, someone spread rumors that the goats had been seen dancing in the local cemetery during the night. Abel knew this was impossible, as the goats never left his property, but the rumor spread quickly and took on increasingly fantastical aspects. The breaking point came when Joaquimio, Dona Francisca's son, disappeared for a few hours one Sunday afternoon. The 8-year-old boy was playing near Abel's property when he vanished, causing panic in the family and the community. Joaquimio was found a few hours later, sleeping peacefully under a tree on Abel's property, surrounded by the 5 goats who seemed to be protecting his sleep. The boy woke up unharmed, explaining that he had gotten lost and that the gentle goats had helped him find a safe place to rest. To Abel and any impartial observer, it was clear that the goats had protected the lost child, but for a community already gripped by suspicion and fear, the incident was interpreted as definitive evidence that something sinister was happening. "Those goats lured my boy," Dona Francisca declared, despite Joaquimio insisting that he had gotten lost on his own. "They have some power over children." Colonel August saw in the incident the opportunity he had been waiting for to take decisive action. "Now there's no more doubt," he announced at a new meeting. "These creatures are a danger to our families. We cannot allow them to remain in our community." The meeting this time was tenser and more polarized. One group, led by the colonel, advocated drastic measures against Abel and his goats. Another, smaller but vocal group, led by Dona Socorro, insisted there was no real evidence of any danger. "What are you proposing?" Dona Socorro asked. "That Abel gets rid of these animals, that he sends them away, or gives them to someone who knows how to handle them properly. And if he refuses, then we will take the necessary measures to protect our community." The colonel's words contained an implicit threat that didn't go unnoticed. Dona Socorro rushed to warn Abel about the ultimatum being prepared. "They're coming here, Abel," she said urgently. "The colonel has convinced many people that your goats are dangerous. You need to make a decision." Abel looked at the 5 goats grazing peacefully in his yard. They had restored his hope, prosperity, and the sense of purpose he thought he'd lost forever. More importantly, he had developed a genuine connection with them, a mutual understanding that transcended the normal relationship between humans and animals. "I can't abandon them, Dona Socorro," he said firmly. "They trusted me, just as I trusted them. It wouldn't be right to hand them over to people who don't understand them." "But Abel, you could be putting yourself in danger. These people are scared, and scared people do things they wouldn't normally do. Maybe it's time someone faced that fear with courage." Abel spent the night awake, mentally preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming. He observed the goats during their nightly ritual, and finally understood what they were doing. It wasn't magic or witchcraft, it was communion. They connected with other creatures through a form of empathy that humans had lost over the centuries. The next morning, as predicted, a crowd headed towards Abel's property. There were about 20 people, led by Colonel August and armed with ropes and sticks, determined to remove the goats by force. Abel waited for them at the gate of his property, positioned between the crowd and the 5 goats who remained silent behind him. He was one man facing an entire community, but there was something about his posture that radiated serene determination. "Abel, step aside," said Colonel August. "We don't want to hurt you, we just came for these creatures." "To take them where?" Abel asked calmly. "Far away from here, to where they can no longer influence our children and our animals." "What if I told you they pose no danger, that they're just different creatures that need understanding instead of fear?" "You're bewitched by them," someone shouted from the crowd. "You can't see what they really are." Abel looked at each person present, recognizing faces of neighbors he'd known for decades. He saw fear in some, anger in others, but he also perceived uncertainty in many gazes. "You've known me for years," he said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "You know what kind of man I am. Do you really think I would protect creatures that could harm anyone?" "You've changed since they arrived," Colonel August replied. "You're not the same man." "It's true, I've changed. I've regained hope. I've come to believe that there is still kindness in the world. These goats taught me that different doesn't mean dangerous, that silence doesn't mean threat." There was a moment of hesitation in the crowd. Some people began to question internally whether there was really any justification for their actions. Then something extraordinary happened. The 5 goats, until then silent behind Abel, slowly walked forward to stand beside him. They showed no fear or aggression, only a serene dignity that touched even the most hardened hearts. One of the goats, the smallest of the group, approached Johnny, who was present with his mother. The boy, unafraid, reached out and stroked the animal's head. The simple and touching scene created a moment of absolute silence in the crowd. "She protected me when I was lost," Johnny said with the honesty typical of children. "She and the others stayed with me so I wouldn't be scared." Dona Francisca looked at her son, then at the goat, then at Abel. Slowly, the anger on her face transformed into something resembling understanding. "Abel," said Colonel August, his voice less firm than before, "you can't deny that these goats are—" "Yes, they are unusual," Abel agreed. "Just as each of us is unusual in our own way, they are silent because they have learned that the world can be hostile to those who are different. They connect with other animals because they have maintained an empathy that we humans have lost." He paused, looking directly at each person present. "You want to destroy this because you are afraid of what you don't understand. But I ask, who really poses a danger here? 5 gentle goats that have never harmed anyone, or a crowd willing to use force against defenseless creatures?" Abel's words echoed in the morning silence. Several people in the crowd began to lower their sticks and ropes, questioning their own motivations. Dona Socorro, who had remained on the periphery of the group, stepped forward and stood beside Abel. "I stand with them too," she announced. "If protecting innocent creatures is a crime, then I'm a criminal too." Her courageous declaration encouraged others. Dona Maria, who had reported the improvement in her hens, joined the group of defenders. Her son, John, whose pigs were healthier, also took a stand beside Abel. Slowly, the crowd divided. On one side, those still dominated by fear and distrust. On the other, people beginning to understand that they had allowed prejudice to cloud their judgment. Colonel Perry realized he was losing support rapidly. His authority, based on fear and rigid conservatism, was being questioned by people he had always considered submissive. "You'll regret this," he said, retreating with his most fervent supporters. "When these creatures show their true nature, you'll remember what I said today." "Colonel," Abel replied sadly, "the only true nature I see here today is that of people willing to destroy what they don't understand. But there's still time to change that." The confrontation ended without physical violence, but with profound consequences for the entire community. Abel had won the immediate battle, but understood that the war against prejudice and fear was far from over. In the days that followed, the Dry Creek community clearly divided between those who supported Abel and his goats and those who continued to see them as a threat. But gradually, as life resumed its normal course without incident, more people began to question their initial positions. The children, always more open than the adults, were the first to approach the goats without fear. They discovered that the animals were affectionate and gentle, and that their presence had a surprisingly calming effect. Abel began to receive curious visitors who wanted to meet the famous silent goats. Some came driven by superstition, but left impressed by the animals' dignity and gentleness. Over time, the goats became a peculiar attraction in the region. People from neighboring towns came to see them, and many left reflecting on their own attitudes towards what they considered different or strange. Colonel Perry never publicly admitted he had been wrong, but gradually stopped campaigning against Abel and his goats. His prestige in the community had diminished, and he understood that insisting on an already discredited position would only further damage his reputation. The most significant transformation happened in Dona Socorro, Johnny's mother. She became one of the most fervent defenders of the goats, regularly visiting Abel's property and bringing her son to interact with the animals. "Abel," she said one afternoon, "I want to apologize for the way I acted. Fear made me think terrible things about you and these innocent creatures. Dona Socorro, there's nothing to forgive. You were protecting your son, and that's understandable. The important thing is that now you see the truth. More than that," she continued, "my Johnny has been different since he started visiting the goats. Calmer, more empathetic towards others. It's as if they teach something important about inner peace." Dona Socorro's words echoed a discovery that many people in the community were making. The presence of the silent goats had a subtle but powerful transformative effect on people who approached them with an open heart. Abel understood that the goats were much more than exceptional animals. They were silent teachers of virtues that humans had forgotten. They taught patience through their serene behavior, empathy through their connection with other creatures, and acceptance through their dignity in the face of misunderstanding. Months after the initial confrontation, life in Dry Creek had changed in a subtle but profound way. The community had become more tolerant of differences, more careful in its judgments, more willing to seek understanding before fearing the unknown. Abel prospered not only materially, but emotionally. He had found a new purpose in life, being the guardian of special creatures and a mediator between different worlds, the world of tradition and the world of the unknown. The 5 goats continued their nightly rituals, but now Abel and some other people in the community sometimes joined them, sitting in a circle and experiencing the deep peace that emanated from those moments of silent communion. During one of these special nights, when the moon was full and the temperature mild, Abel felt the spiritual presence of Conception beside him. It wasn't a vision or a hallucination, but an intimate certainty that his wife approved of the path he had chosen. "You have found your true mission," her voice seemed to whisper in his mind. "It wasn't just to take care of the land, but to take care of creatures that the world doesn't understand." That night, Abel fully understood the meaning of the prophetic words Conception had spoken years ago. "You have a caregiver's soul. One day this will be your blessing." His empathetic nature, which some saw as a weakness, had been revealed as his greatest strength. Jedediah Coyote never appeared in the region again, but his presence remained alive in the transformation that his special goats had brought to Dry Creek. Some people speculated about who he really was and where he came from, but Abel had come to the conclusion that it didn't matter. What mattered was the gift he had left: 5 extraordinary creatures that taught about acceptance, empathy, and courage. The small community of Dry Creek became known in the region as a special place, where tolerance and understanding had conquered fear and prejudice. And at the center of this transformation, 5 silent goats continued to graze peacefully, guarded by a man who had discovered that his greatest strength lay in his ability to protect misunderstood creatures. Dona Socorro, now considered one of the wisest women in the region, used to say that Abel and his goats had taught the community the most important lesson of all. True courage isn't about attacking what we don't understand, but about defending what we know is innocent, even when we're alone. The goats remained with Abel for the rest of his life,
and when each of them passed away naturally, years later, they left behind a legacy of tolerance and understanding that passed down through generations. Johnny, the boy they had protected, grew up to become a veterinarian and dedicated his life to caring for animals that others considered problems. The legacy of the 5 quiet goats transcended their own existences. They had shown that difference can be a gift, that silence can be wisdom, and that sometimes the greatest teachers come in the humblest and most unexpected forms. And Abel, the man who chose to protect misunderstood creatures instead of giving in to collective fear, became a living symbol that individual compassion can transform entire communities, one courageous person at a time.